Our next speaker is Jeffrey Sterling, who's going to be speaking on the legal rights of protesters. Jeffrey is a whistleblower advocate at Roots Action and a former CIA officer who served 2.5 years in prison after being convicted of violating the Espionage Act. His memoir, Unwanted Spy, The Persecution of an American Whistleblower, was published in 2019. Jeffrey, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
Of course,
Um,
yeah, please take it away.
all right. I'll be discussing the current landscape of repression against free speech and the legal rights of protesters to speak out and organize, particularly on campus. This will be a very broad, high-level overview. Though the focus is on universities, protests on universities, it applies outside of universities as well. I am by no means an expert, and things vary from state to state and campus to campus. So don't treat this as legal advice. I have been intimately familiar with what can happen when you choose to exercise so-called guaranteed or constitutional rights when they're inconvenient to the powers that be. You quickly learn how the guarantee is anything but. Sometimes when you're subjected to the law, you can't help but find yourself a de facto expert on the subject. So, with regard to free speech and protesting, free speech and assembly, particularly on college campuses, has been a cornerstone of higher education and expression in this country. Think back to the Vietnam War protests, the teach-ins, the protests in the 80s against apartheid, the free speech movements in the 60s. The list goes on. And we have all benefited from those movements. Now, what right do we have to express ourselves with free speech? The First Amendment of the Constitution protects the right to assemble and express through views through protest. Now, that right is not absolute. There are examples of what is not protected, like incitement to violence, true threats, fighting words, words that are likely to provoke immediately violence, obscenity in some contexts. It's funny, whenever I think of, and this would be a topic for a whole different discussion, whenever I think of what free speech is not protected, immediately January 6th come to mind. If you want a good examples of what is not and should not be protected speech. So where do, say, universities fit within our constitutional right to free speech? Now, public universities are directly bound by the First Amendment. Private universities, not directly, but they still have to abide by state laws and their own policies that uphold free speech principles. Universities do have responsibilities to ensure safety and a non-discriminatory environment. With this responsibility, universities can regulate the time, place, and manner of protests in order to maintain order and ensure safety. Whatever the restrictions are on free speech and also the reactions to that free speech, they must be content neutral, meaning they must apply equally to all forms of expression, regardless of their message. For example, a law prohibiting loud noises in a residential area at night would be considered content neutral. But we've seen how universities have responded to free speech, particularly with regard to the pro-Palestinian protests. During the protests, they've been weaponizing campus and local law enforcement to forcibly quash free speech. There's been suspensions of students and faculty. And afterwards, some universities have revised their free speech policies, but in actuality, some of those policies are tantamount to anti-protest and anti-free speech policies. For example, many are establishing free speech zones that are far away from the traditional free speech venues, limits on the size of gatherings, requiring pre-approval for rallies or demonstrations. Now, to me, that is absolutely counter to spontaneity, which is a hallmark of protests. So I live in the St. Louis area, and it was so wonderful, the spontaneity of the protests that happened after Michael Brown was killed. Imagine if they had to have pre-approval for any of those protests. Pre-approval for a protest is tantamount to stopping the protest before it even starts. And a lot of these policies from universities and municipalities, they're very vague and they're too open-ended. and they may lead to confusion with regard to what is permissible on both sides of the matter. Now, have the policies and reactions, particularly with regard to the pro-Palestinian movements, have they been content neutral? No, there are notable differences. I think we can examine the responses that happened during the racial justice protests in 2020 and the current pro-Palestinian protests. With regard with the racial justice protests, there was generally more sympathetic or at least tolerant institutional and university responses with, certainly not as many arrests as we've seen recently, or police interventions. And maybe because that universities have claimed to publicly support racial justice. But on the other side of it, the pro-Palestinian protests, these protests have challenged more politically sensitive institutional positions. Therefore, the responses have been more aggressive, punitive, and outright confrontational. They're challenging the very nature of our constitutional right under the First Amendment to free speech. So, I'm not saying all of this as a way to scare anyone away from protesting. But yeah, how do you prepare, to protest in such an environment? No. First and foremost, understand what the law is, understand what your rights are, understand what, if you're on a campus, what the policies are with regard to free speech. And also coordinate with groups like the National Lawyers Guild or local lawyers to have legal observers present if you plan to protest, and have them there at the ready in case there are arrests. Now, social media is a wonderful outlet, but please be careful and understand that, for a university student, social media is not beyond the reach of a university who may want to punish you for your views or punish you for wanting to organize a protest or anything like that. And with regard to that, also, be careful of using anything that if you're a student, your .edu email. Don't use that for anything related to any protest or movement that you would like to try to do. And we all have our cell phones. And I think we've seen in the reports, many students have had difficulties getting their cell phones back after they were confiscated, in the wake of some of the pro-Palestinian protests. Uh, think differently about how you communicate with your cell phone. Think that you want more secure, more encrypted communications. Great avenue for that is Signal. Understand, learn about Signal, and use that as an outlet for your communications. Now, and also, I think first and foremost, most importantly, understand what nonviolence means. You may be confronted as you're protesting with violence, even though that is not what you are there doing, not what you were trying to incite. The Teaching Network website has excellent information and resources on nonviolence and on how to protest. And I encourage you to go to the website to take a look at those resources, educate yourself on nonviolence and how to protest. Because they're going to be throwing the law at you. They're going to weaponize the law against you. But the law is also there to help you. The law is also there on your side. If they can come at you with the law, you can defend yourself with the law. Even in the face of opposition, stay true to your purpose. It will and has sparked conversation, and that can be the very beginning, the most important beginning of change. Thank
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Always appreciated to chat with you. I do have a couple questions for you.
you.
You talk about the vague laws. Do you think the vague laws are on purpose?
I think so. And that's what we generally have the courts for. If they're vague, then neither side will know exactly what it is. And that makes a law unenforceable. If it's too broadly vague, then it can't be enforced. But you have to go through the process of being persecuted by that law to then get into the discussion of how to change that law.
Good. Thank you. You also talked about these laws needing to be content neutral. But if the law's written content neutral, that's one thing. Is the enforcement ever content neutral?
Well, that's what's also examined, as I said, content neutral with regard to the speech or restrictions on the speech, but also the reaction to that speech. If university group is going to come down hard on pro-Palestinians, but maybe there's some other political group that they who has the same sort of protest. I mean, that reaction also has to be content neutral. If it's not, if there is a difference, then that's in abeyance of the first of the principles of free speech in the Constitution.
Well, thank you. And I guess last thing you mentioned, you were in St. Louis. I went to Ferguson at the 1 year anniversary of the Michael Brown murder. Have you noticed, have the cops relaxed? It was bad a year later when I was there. Have things improved there? Did the protests, did they work in any way?
I think the protests were very effective. I think, unfortunately, as Linda had mentioned, people afterwards and time passes, they've gone out to brunch. Things haven't changed. The police force has gone back to the way it was, complete disregard for anyone considered a threat, anyone with brown skin. But I think the foundation is there, and people did start to rise up and say no, stand up and make their voices heard. So the impact was there. We need more people at the ready, I think.
Right. Thank you very